Everyone, it's Professor Cushing. Welcome to week 2 of Environmental Studies 152. For this mini clip, I'd like to talk to you about your readings for this week from the Friedman book. This is the Friedman book. We're going to be talking about chapters 1 and 4. So let's talk about chapter 1 first. And chapter 1 has to do with, just read the title to you. Why Citibank, Iceland's banks, and the ice banks of Antarctica all melted down at the same time. And I think the most important concepts that you want to take from the reading are these. First of all, this idea of underpricing risk and how underpricing risk contributed heavily to the economic downturn that occurred in the fall of 2008. In the chapter, he talks about the example of providing subprime mortgages to people who actually couldn't really afford them. And the money was lent out that was at a relatively high risk of not being paid back. This is in comparison to conventional mortgages where you're putting 20, 30, even 40% of the house price down. A lot of times people would be putting no money down, or they wouldn't even have to provide verification of employment. It was a very, very kind of crazy time in the mortgage lending industry. He argues that this game worked because the credit bubble kept on making it easier and easier for people to get mortgages, and also that the prices of houses kept rising. So as long as you could kind of flip the house before a big balloon payment was due, you would still make out okay. States Friedman on page 17, the whole system depended upon people who originated the risk, profiting from that origination, and then transferring that risk to someone else and never having to be responsible for it afterwards. He calls this kind of I'll be gone, you'll be gone, IBG, YBG. So that's kind of an important concept from the chapter. And the other important concept that he uses to explain the financial meltdown is this idea of socializing losses. So while all these people, these private firms and individuals were making money loaning out all these bad mortgages to people, a cost had to be paid. Eventually the bubble burst, the system crashed, exemplified by the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And we, as a country, needed to establish a $700 billion emergency fund to bail out the banks and to stabilize some of these really large firms to kind of keep the U.S. economy going, to prevent a run on the banks. You might ask yourself, where did this $700 billion come from? But it came from the U.S. Treasury, which is funded, as you know, by taxpayer dollars. So this is what Friedman means by socializing losses. So, the gains occurred through this underpricing of risk, and the gains were privatized, meaning that companies and individuals got to put money in their pocket after they did all these financial transactions. But at the end, when the bubble burst and there was prices to be paid, it was the American public that had to pay them. So that's our society socializing the loss. On pages 22 and 23, Friedman makes an analogy between financial banks and the ice banks of Antarctica. And he argues that the same fraudulent accounting method that led to the collapse of the U.S. and in part the global economy in 2008 has also kind of started leading to the collapse of natural ecosystems and the Earth as we know it. As one of Friedman's interviewees points out, he says, we've been getting rich by depleting all our natural stocks, water, hydrocarbons, forests, rivers, fish, and arable land, and by not generating renewable flows. You get this burst of wealth that we have created from rapacious behavior. But it has to collapse unless adults stand up and say, this is a Ponzi scheme. We have not generated real wealth, and we are destroying a livable climate. Real wealth is something you can pass on in a way that others can enjoy. So what the interviewee is trying to say is that we have kind of grown wealthy on nature's resources, but that this wealth is not sustainable, and that we're kind of living on the natural credit, buying into future reserves that our children and our children's children will have to pay for. And that doesn't seem like a very sustainable way for our societies to be living right now. In Friedman's eyes, the privatizing gains equivalent of the financial crisis on the environmental side have been the benefits that we in private companies have gained from cheap, underpriced energy and other natural resources. Examples of a socializing loss have been the long-term buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the destruction of habitats, the pollution of river systems, massive species extinctions, and the loss of forests and wetlands. And this is just to name a few examples of the very severe environmental problems that we are facing today. On pages 24 and 25, he quotes from the United Nations Millennium Ecosystem Report, which has some very sobering views. Just a couple of quotes from them, which I find actually fairly depressing, but startling enough to make me take notice. The report states, human activity is putting such a strain on the natural functions of the Earth that the ability of the planet's ecosystems to sustain future generations can no longer be taken for granted. And I find that incredibly startling, that my children may not enjoy the bounty of natural resources that I have enjoyed in my lifetime, and that that bounty might be further diminished for their children. That's something that actually does keep me up at night. The report also goes on to state that 60% of the world's ecosystems have now been degraded, and that between 10 and 30% of the mammal, bird, and amphibian species on the Earth today are currently threatened with extinction. Friedman goes on to argue that we've done a bad job accounting for risk associated with big global environmental issues like climate change. So again, to make this analogy between the financial crisis and the environmental crisis, another one of his interviewees goes on to say, we're acting like AIG. So that was one of those big financial and insurance firms that kind of went south during the economic downturn in 2008. So he says, we're acting like AIG in our approach to climate change. We're weighing the risks and benefits of action on the assumption that climate change will unfold predictably as temperatures rise, that we can kind of figure out what's going to happen and that we'll be able to mitigate accordingly. In doing so, we are discounting to zero two risks, which he thinks is a bad idea. The risk of a much greater increase than we had anticipated in temperature change, and also the risk of a non-linear response by the climate system. So we're kind of saying, okay, climate temperature is going up like this, okay, and then the effects will kind of go up like this. But what if it's not a linear change? What if it's more like a step function? Like here is the effect, and then here, and then something else happens. And so these kinds of risks we're not really accounting for, and they could lead to very, very severe environmental impacts. At the end of the chapter, Friedman argues for what he calls a new normal, one that is much more sustainable and healthy for the market and for Mother Nature. Hello everyone, I'm here to talk about highlights from chapter 4 of Friedman, which is entitled Today's Date, 1 ECE, Today's Weather, Hot, Flat, and Crowded. So the main concepts that I want you to take away from the chapter are an understanding of what Friedman means by the terms hot, flat, and crowded. Don't just take those terms literally, there's a lot more behind those terms. And also 5 key problems that a hot, flat, and crowded world is kind of rapidly exacerbating or making worse. So when Friedman talks about a world that is flat, actually that was the subject of his previous book, he means kind of a leveling of the economic playing field enabled by information technology and communications technology. So that means that an individual in Dubai or an individual in Cape Town, South Africa can participate on an equal playing field, for example, doing graphic design as somebody in Silicon Valley. So really enabling many, many more people to participate in the global marketplace, but also to participate in the global culture and exchange of ideas. By crowded, he is referring to exponential population growth. And I think that some of the statistics he presents in the book give you kind of a scary picture of what might be happening over the next 50 years. We're looking at about a population of 9 billion by 2050, 2060, which is certainly a whole lot of mouths to feed and a lot of drains on natural resources. And by hot, he is referring to global climate change, which is almost certainly due to human activities associated with large-scale manufacturing. So hot, flat, and crowded. Okay, those are the three really important concepts that he's trying to drive home in this. And in this chapter, Friedman also talks about 5 key problems that a hot, flat, and crowded world is dramatically intensifying. And those are an increasing demand for scarcer and scarcer energy and natural resources, a massive transfer of wealth to oil-rich countries and their petrodictators, he calls them, disruptive climate change, energy poverty, and rapidly accelerating biodiversity. And he goes on, after kind of introducing the problems, to give you more examples. And let me just give you an example of what he's talking about when he discusses these concepts. For example, for energy demand, he said, at the start of 2004, the International Energy Agency predicted that demand for oil would grow by 1.5 million barrels a day. Instead, it grew by 3 million barrels a day, and demand in China was 1 million barrels a day. So this is telling you that we are really, really using resources at an alarmingly rapid rate. And for wealth transfer to petrodictatorships, Friedman points out the example of Russia cutting off natural gas supplies to Ukraine to intimidate the newly elected pro-Western government. For climate change, a fact that I found fairly alarming was information that he presented from a 2007 Sigma Chi report, which said even with the relatively small rise in global average temperature of 0.8 degrees Celsius that we have seen so far since 1750, this has been accompanied by significant increases of floods, droughts, heat waves, and wildfires, large reductions in the extent of summer sea ice in the Arctic, and large increases in the summer melting of the Greenland ice sheet. In addition to that, the movement in the geographic and altitudinal ranges of large numbers of plants and animal species. So we're really talking about environmental change on a planetary scale, which is something that we in the environmental field have not really been talking about before. This is massive, massive, massive. And I hope that by reading this chapter, you get an understanding of the scale of impacts we are talking about, and it's unprecedented. As for energy poverty, he talks about a story in Bloomberg News where the number of generators imported by South Africans went from 790 in 2003 in one quarter to over 44,000. It's just giving you an example of how much the need for energy has increased. And also he points out that if you don't have energy, you can't really participate in the global economy, and that your ability to participate meaningfully even in the local economy is severely diminished. He also makes the point that if you don't have the energy to fuel your infrastructure development to mitigate against climate change impacts like sea level rise, and you live in an energy poor community, your ability to protect yourself is going to be severely challenged. And then for the last category of major impacts, he talks about biodiversity loss. And again, there's some depressing news for us. Half the world's tropical and temperate rainforests are now gone, and the rate of deforestation in the tropics continues at about an acre a second. So let's just take a minute to think about that. An acre is the size of a football field. So we're losing that much tropical forest every second, a football field every second. And with that, I'll kind of conclude my summary of Chapter 4 and come back to you with a clip on the Globalization 101 website. Hi everyone, I'm back and I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the Globalization 101 website, which I think provides a really good overview of some of the main concepts related to globalization and the environment. So on the discussions instructions, it says to spend 30 minutes on the website reading the general introductory material on what is globalization. I also want you to review the sections on trade and on the environment. Okay. In particular, for the trade section, make sure you read Primer 1, which is the economics of international trade, and make sure you understand those general economic concepts, like why do countries export, and why do countries import, and what is trade liberalization, what is a comparative advantage, what is opportunity cost, who does the U.S. trade with, and how has the makeup of the U.S. economy changed over time. These are all kind of basic pieces of information about the U.S. and international economies that you should be familiar with. In addition, you should review the environment section and think about the extent to which environmental agreements and environmental concerns have been recognized in the context of international trade. For the most part, they have been kind of handled separately, but as Friedman points out, and as you'll see in course readings, globalization in regards to trade and its environmental impacts are related. And so the fact that they don't seem to be incorporated into a lot of international trade agreements, and even the cases that have been brought forward, for example, the NAFTA cases, have kind of struggled for recognition and kind of lingered in the court. And so the resolution of some of these issues that have been brought up have not really had clear conclusions. As you are reading the material on the Globalization 101 website, I also want you to, while you're in the trade section, take the quiz to review the webpage material, and I'll provide you with the link in a note on the course homepage, and you should be able to find it yourself also. And make sure that you know the answers to questions 1 through 14. So it's a pretty straightforward multiple choice quiz, and then right after you take the quiz, you can submit your answers, and then you'll see the your answers and the correct results right away. So just make sure you know the answers to questions 1 through 14. And the final thing I wanted to talk to you about was just their definition of globalization. I'm going to read it out to you and then kind of make a comparison to some other concepts that have been put forward in the Friedman reading on globalization. So, according to Globalization 101, globalization is a process of interaction and integration among the people, companies, and governments of different nations. A process driven by international trade and investment and aided by information technology. This process has effects on the environment, on culture, on political systems, on economic development and prosperity, and on human physical well-being in societies around the world. Okay, so let's think about some of the terms in this definition. It's very rich and encompasses some of the same ideas described by Friedman. So key words to note in this definition are the active terms interaction and integration. So that is kind of the coming together and commingling of ideas and actions. in the Globalization 101 definition, the driving force behind globalization is international trade and investment, both large-scale financial mechanisms. If you ever heard of the phrase, money makes the world go around, that's what they're talking about here. Like Friedman, the process of globalization is kind of moved forward by information technology. And finally, the definition identifies major areas that are impacted by the process of globalization. The environment, culture, that is systems of beliefs, norms, institutions, and traditions, economic development, which we call kind of the wealth of a nation or society, and human physical well-being. So it's a good definition. It's a complicated definition, and actually one of the assignments for this week is for you to kind of come up with your own definition of globalization. So I encourage you to kind of take a moment, take a cup of coffee, think about what you've been reading, sit down in a quiet place, and think about what globalization means to you and how it affects you, either at the conscious level or the subconscious level, and how you see the impacts of globalization affecting your life every day. All right, so I look forward to reading your posts this week, and please check back to the website several times this week to see what other people have posted and to respond to those posts, and I will make another video message to you on Monday. Thanks.